Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're dialing in from. Really excited to be joined by my partner in crime here, Miguel, today and talk through kind of the evolution of the access management space and how integration, coverage, and depth plays a role into the efficacy of these programs and how that's continuing to evolve over time as environments modernize. Um, like I said, it's Miguel and I here today, both with P0 Security. Um, I lead market strategy. I'll be taking a lens of kind of the market landscape and where some of the tensions are emerging in this space and hitting um, some capacity limits and also where some gaps are surfacing. And Miguel will be here to keep me honest, bringing in kind of the engineering reality behind solving some of these harder problems and why getting this integration layer right is harder than it looks. And we welcome questions throughout. So please use the chat, come off mute, and anything that we can't get to live, we'll be sure to follow up with after the fact. So we want to start off here just kind of acknowledging um, where this space has come from, um, and the the categories or the pillars of a typical identity access management program in most organizations, um, and how that's continued to evolve over time. I think if you think to when most of these programs were put into place, largely on-prem environments, pretty human-centric workflows, usually like an admin, checking out a credential, and some pretty straightforward lifecycle management use cases. And in this world, we saw an emergence of a pretty clean division between IGA, IAM, which is not pictured here, but from an access management perspective, IGA and PAM. And if you think of this as like a scale in terms of coverage of resources and applications, you have IGA on the left here, which is much more focused on breadth of coverage across workforce access, typically handled by GRC teams or IT teams, mostly for um, managing lifecycle, like I said, making sure that there's compliance, user access reviews, all of that sort of thing. And then on the PAM side, it's an entirely different team that tends to manage these platforms, focused on really sensitive access and making sure that there's deep infrastructure control. And in many teams and organizations, like these worlds don't collide. There wasn't much overlap, and these two domains really had their rightful place on either end of the fence. Um, as we've moved into more cloud-centric environments with non-human identities, agentic identities, this kind of no man's land that we have in the middle here seems to be more of a glaring gap or a more critical space than it has previously held. And you'll hear some people argue like a convergence of IGA convert and PAM. But I think what we're really seeing and believe at P0 is that this in-between space is actually where a lot of modern access risk lives, and where a lot of teams are kind of struggling to extend these programs from either end to fill in the gaps. Anything you'd add there, Miguel?
Yeah, I like how you brought up the convergence point. I think what we've seen is kind of a blending of some of the two, mostly around the concepts in IGA that have been moving towards PAM and vice versa. I think historically, like you had also called out earlier, we noticed that people kind of approached IGA using these long life cycle reviews and they kept asking the question, well, what if this was shorter? And what if this was shorter? And eventually it got to the point where you wanted to achieve similar or the same granularity that you would have with like your PAM programs, right? And on the flip side, the PAM program started to ask similar questions with IGA is how am I able to provision someone new and make sure that they have just the right amount of access that they need to? So I think I may not use the word convergence, but I do think we see a blending of the two philosophies now.
Yep. Yeah. And as we think of that blending and what's causing it, and also, whether it's a convergence or a gap, this tension that exists in that middle area here, um, this visual is meant to be a depiction of the complexity of these spaces and what can feel like chaos to a lot of teams in terms of all of these tools that have cropped up to both enable access workflows, secure, monitor, um, everything in between. It's taken on a life of its own, especially as the types of identities have expanded, the types of resources that need to be managed have expanded, and it can really feel like there's the access paths and footprint is outpacing these controls that have been put in place for kind of a different set of circumstances.
Yeah, similarly, we've seen the massive explosion in resources in the last 20 years, right? The amount of tools that we need to actually get our job done and the level of granularity that those tools offer differ widely.
Mm,
And and it's become very apparent that there isn't this unified framework between any of them that anybody can seem to agree on. That increases the challenge even further now in the more modern age around non-human identities like AI agents and machines, who also have their own unique protocols with how they engage and interact with everything. So I think like kind of the bullet point here that some access management really has aged quite poorly, and it continues to be a gap that needs to be filled.
I think that's a really good transition to this slide in terms of some of the gaps that need to be filled. I think if you think of authentication as extremely simplified, answering the question of who are you, and then authorization answering the question of should you or it, if it's a machine or agentic identity, be doing this right now, given the context, a business context at hand. And I think a lot of existing programs or stacks handle the first layer pretty well. There's standards in place. Of course, they're evolving to extend to agentic like everything else. But it feels like there's been more strides and consistency made in this space. But because of the complexity that we just spoke through on the previous slide, this authorization layer um, remains, I think, for most organizations, an opportunity to kind of centralize control. Uh, um, Verifying the identity itself, while important, is not sufficient in terms of establishing trust and control. And you really need to have that proven business context um, in order to assess policy in a way where it can be applied before these sensitive actions are taken. So you can minimize the risk while also still enabling the business to be agile and productive.
Yeah, and I think one other thing worth calling out here is how in the first layer you'll notice that all of these systems, they don't really communicate with one another. And something we've learned quite rapidly recently, internally and externally in the industry as a whole, is that permissions compound the risks, as in the risks are more than the sum of their parts. Just getting access to a secret may not be as dangerous, but the more and more permissions you stack on top of each other, the more dangerous those permissions as a group actually become. It's quite often that people are trying to exploit several roles or several permission boundaries at once in order to gain access to a more critical system. And so, because all these systems aren't really communicating with one another, this making informed decisions about who should have access to what is very difficult. And that's kind of where P0 security helps come in, not only as a control plane, but as like a decision framework that helps you analyze across all of these different disparate tools, whether or not the access that you're going to be granting carries wider risks that may not be apparent if you're just looking at one vertical slice, right? Um, the P0 is like deciding and enforcing and kind of proving what every identity should be doing.
What about from that same lens, Miguel? Can you talk a little bit to the operational burden there too? Like risk for sure, but how does that impact like the day-to-day operations of a team needing to look across all these systems?
Yeah, I mean, something I think about a lot is the knowledge overhead that's required to just get people's job done. Having to figure out how to configure your policies across potentially 5 to 10 different tools, different CSPs, especially if you get to the level of granularity where you're now trying to figure out who should have access to what VMs. It can be a major headache for your security teams, right? That's like a massive knowledge burden. And even if we just think of that in terms of like AI tokens, that's going to be a lot of tokens just spent trying to figure out and put the pieces together. And I think from an operational standpoint, that's one of the promises that P0 helps deliver is you have a single pane of glass, a single point of decision making that you can look at and very quickly assess the overall health of your current status, but also what granting someone access might do to the overall health of your system.
hmm And the same on the end user experience too, right? Is like, I mean, as an engineer, like in your given day, you're going to be touching multitudes of these different systems, and if you have different workflows for each, like that can, I imagine, like create a lot of drag and potentially even incentivize you to figure out how to work around some of that if you can.
Yeah,
Not that you would,
exactly.
of course, you're exemplary in that way.
But it's true. I think the harder you make it to do the right thing, the more likely you are to do the wrong thing, even without malicious intent. But just, having three different Slack bots in order to request access you'll find more often than not that a developer will say, well, I might as well just get access for the whole day. I don't want to have to figure this out again, or I might as well get access for 2 weeks.
Right, right. So what we're showing here is kind of like we talked about it theoretically or in principle, this need to shift from authentication-based controls to authorization. Um, and the left column here is visualizing how this more like account level standing access, credential-based access model compares to what runtime access control can enable. So that fine-grained ephemeral access that's really scoped to the task at hand so that the risk doesn't outlive the work that needs to be done. So pretty simplistic view here, but just demonstrating how you can move from like that coarse-grained control to really specific and control and fine-grained access mechanisms.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the dynamic business context here is part of the most important entitlement level controls that organizations can sometimes lack. I
Mm.
think it's great to know who can do what, but the why behind it is just as important, if not more important. I think the concept we have is kind of this paradigm shift where we're moving away from people being allowed to do things to not only like people, but also non-human identities being allowed to do things, but more of a focus on the things that can be done to a target system and whether or not those things are safe to do in general. Should people be allowed to delete databases? Is a different question to ask than like, should the CTO be allowed to delete a database or not?
Interesting. And and can you talk a little bit of like back to that end your user experience, like what does it look like for a day in the life of Miguel if you're accessing systems leveraging the model on the left versus the right? Like, can you help bring that to life a little bit?
Yeah, I mean on the left-hand side, it's my day-to-day is pretty much just trying to navigate the complexity of a CSP in order to figure out what I do or don't have access to, which is maybe dependent on my role at the time, maybe
Mm.
dependent on my team, or just who I am in general, like what parts of the system I've worked on.
So
Uh,
you get put into a group or something, and then that kind of sets your reality, basically.
Yeah, and sometimes what you're allowed to do isn't immediately clear, right? So I've definitely had moments where I'm just clicking around the AWS console, just trying to figure out like, am I allowed to look at billing or not? And then if I'm not allowed to, having to have a lengthy conversation with why I should be allowed to have a billing and explaining to other teams the ramifications of giving the entire group that I belong to kind of that permission. Or ironically, what ends up happening is I would just be given a very special role assigned to me, which is where, you know, kind of the shift is, well, should I be focusing on what Miguel is allowed to do, or should I be focusing on the ability to read billing, right? And so that kind of transforms my day to day into what it is now, where a lot of times when I'm doing the work, I know pretty clearly what it is that I need to do to get that work accomplished. For example, if I'm responding to a customer call, I might just need to read a specific database table that has very specific information to help them. And that's really all I'll have access to. And this also protects me against accidentally leaking the wrong information or accidentally downloading or seeing something I shouldn't have on that database.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't heard it framed that way of it's protection for the individual. Like that's a lot to put on folks to give them broad standing like pseudo access for whatever, because then they're attached to whatever ramifications might come from that as well, either by, having compromise or even if it's not something malicious, just accidental, like that's a big responsibility for any individual employee to carry.
Yeah, I don't want to be liable for those things, and anything I can do or anything that my security teams can do to protect me from that liability would be great. It's like a an emotional burden you kind of have to carry once you have the keys to the kingdom, right? If you know that, hey, I have pseudo access to all production systems, you're gonna start getting very nervous just opening your emails because you're gonna be thinking, is this a phishing email? And all those interactions, they tend to slow you down a little bit. All that
Hmm.
time spent thinking about what does this mean if I were to get compromised. Whereas if you're focusing more on the entitlement level control, it's still helpful to think that way, but you have a safety net, right? Where you
Right.
know that if something were to happen, you are not as big of a liability for the organization as you might have been before with just account level access.
So let's talk about um, those that don't have the emotional burden that you just talked us through, Miguel. Agents have entered the chat in a big way, and they are shifting the game in terms of if you think back to that slide that we opened up with of what's considered privileged or sensitive on this kind of scale of broad to deep coverage. I think agents are having forcing teams to kind of renegotiate what they consider to be sensitive systems and applications, because the same permission held by a very conscientious human like Miguel, who's thinking about the ramifications of everything and the responsibility of the privilege that he holds, that's a very different risk profile than when an agent has the same permission set, but they don't have the real world context or that human conscience that we've previously built our access governance and access management programs around. And these are two examples of what can go wrong when the proper guardrails aren't in place. And agents go to just pursue a goal using whatever means necessary, whether it's a rogue malicious action or just a mistake of a very earnest agent trying to keep the end or initiating identity pleased with their output. The consequences can be pretty dire across the board here. So they're really optimizing for that task completion rather than the potential risk or fallout from any given action. Um, can you talk a little bit about the control failures that we have called out here on the bottom of the slide, Miguel?
Yeah, I think like the three here, loose delegation, standing privileged, and broken attribution, I think they all pose a serious risk for humans, but especially for AI. I don't think we've ever seen failure that scales so well. Like in the example here with Pocket, it's one thing for a human to delete a database. It probably takes them a while. You might be able to stop them before they get to the third or fourth. But it's another thing to be able to delete databases within 9 seconds, right?
Right.
It makes you ask the question of, the standing privilege that these systems have. Like, should they really be granted that permission? Do they know what it means to even have that permission? And I think that is, of the three, one of the most dangerous access control failures that we've seen in practice.
With agents. Yeah, and that's like that begets the point of like, would the human even drop the database? Because they know, and it's like kind of that intangible, that like qualitative knowledge that's hard to program into the agents kind of factoring of what work they're accomplishing, which makes it trickier for everyone involved, both the agent, the people leveraging the agents, and the folks trying to protect that access and the business in the process.
Yeah, exactly. The dynamic business context that we were talking about,
Mm,
it's expensive. It's expensive to make sure that AIs are up to date with the latest going on. In fact, you'll end up having to over provision them so they may be able to be given access to things like your documentation or more code bases than they otherwise shouldn't in an effort to stay as up to date as possible. And that kind of talks a lot about that loose delegation model where you start just treating the AI maybe incorrectly as a superhuman who should have access to everything and so that they can stay up to date. But
hmm
the cost isn't just going to be tokens. It could potentially be outages or in this case, accidentally exposing all of your OAuth tokens.
Yeah. And as standards and things catch up too, it can be pretty hefty compliance fines if agents trend in the direction that human and workload access has. And for all intensive purposes, they should and they should quickly.
Yeah. And that also actually gets me to a third point here on the broken attribution front, but just this
Yeah.
idea that especially with what you brought up with compliance is it's really hard to stay up to date, right? And it becomes even more risky to get it wrong.
Right. So as we think about the authorization layer that we've detailed and how that runtime access control can make such a material difference in terms of how teams are managing privilege and access control in general, as you look to extend those same control models to agents, there's a few nuances and complexities that we wanted to detail here. As agents are put into more day-to-day workflows to help with productivity and efficiency, it's important to note that while the same principles should apply, the same risks certainly do, just at a different scale, like we were speaking to. The method to secure that authorization um, needs to match the way in which agents are gaining access. And it's a much larger or longer, excuse me, and more nuanced kind of action chain that an agent takes. And every hop, if you will, or every control point adds variability and risk to this equation. So from the originating identity, whether that be human or machine, a service account that's running on a, weekly automation or something, the agent itself who may serve the entire company across a number of different use cases. But for this, specific task, serving a specific originating identity, the tools that it's leveraging to get work done, and the sensitive resources that end target system itself. So that the question isn't just like, okay, can this agent take this task? It's not as simple as taking the model that we walked through earlier and just saying, okay, agents are a new identity. Let's ask the same question. It's really a factor of blending that authority of the originating identity and the agent so that neither can kind of escalate outside of the other. That becomes part of the scoping question. Um, and then you move into what is the business context? Can they leverage these tools and reach these resources under this policy? And I think what's important to call out here is if people move too quickly or without regard to the foundational human and machine access hygiene, it becomes a much taller task to try to address agentic access control because there's such a tight interconnection there in terms of what an agent should be able to do with what authority, um, at what level, what time. So a lot thrown at you there, Miguel. Can you help break that down a little bit for folks?
Yeah, and I kind of want to focus on the first part of this, the blended identity, because I think this is where the like a major part of the crux of this problem really lies.
Mhm.
It's that it's very difficult to, and even now for orgs to define the type of delegation model that the human gives to their agent, or whether a delegation model is necessary if you have agents, ephemeral agents potentially just running in the cloud, uh, just continuously getting work done, right? And so
Mm.
I find that a lot of businesses, they usually know pretty clearly what tools an agent and a human, potentially blended or not blended, should be using. But really, it's trying to figure out, is this agent acting on behalf of, or is this agent acting like for me, or is this agent acting completely independent? That usually helps you kind of make these downstream decisions. And then the other hardest part for us as well is trying to figure out exactly what actions these identities should take ahead of time. And that's where it becomes really important to actually have some sort of proper assessment of the lay of the land before you start handing the agent and even the originator permissions to start taking potentially risky actions.
Right, that makes sense. And we'll get into that discovery piece a little bit later. But something I want to double click on there is that even in the case if it's not if the agent isn't being invoked, so to speak, it's acting independently to get work done, like you said, that attribution that we were speaking to on the previous slide is still super important because there needs to be an accountable human at the end of the day. And same that we learned with machines and NHIs broadly, is that uh, even if there is not a human in the loop per se, which we expect to see for productivity reasons, and that's kind of like the nature of what's trying to be accomplished here. Um, there still needs to be traceability and accountability for audit purposes, yes, but also just for risk mitigation and lifecycle management too. So as we come back to coverage and kind of the prompt of this webinar, which is around how much coverage is enough coverage, or like do you go for breadth with IGA or depth with PAM? Is there something in the middle? Um, we have created this kind of framework to help teams right size coverage. And our belief is that it shouldn't be one size fits all and that um, it should be uh, kind of correlated to the sensitivity and the different inputs of each individual resource. And of course, there's going to be natural groupings or like levels of applications and resources that can be treated pretty similarly. But this exercise is basically saying for each system or application, look at the complexity of the target system, the potential blast radius or impact of that access or that system falling into the wrong hands or inappropriate guardrails to control what actions can be taken. Um, who or what is actually acting in it. This is where we are talking about like a human with a certain permission set has a much different risk profile than an autonomous agent. And use kind of those core variables to assess the depth of connection and coverage that's needed on more of a case by case basis. I think this can help with kind of a walk, crawl, run approach as well. You hear tales on both like an I don't want to say legacy, but like an IGA, like an OG IGA and PAM tool where it's years before these things are fully implemented. And when we move to the cloud and more API based environments, it takes care of a lot of that, but there's still like, hundreds, if not thousands of resources in most workforces. So this kind of framework can give you a mental model not only to assess like the appropriate level of coverage, but also prioritization exercise as well in terms of, every team has limited resources um, and various priorities, but where can you make the biggest impact and kind of get that 80/20 in terms of like value to effort for where you're putting your access controls in place.
Yeah, resources are, I think, one of the major constraints that we're all dealing with, right? And we've encouraged people to move away from the box checking exercise or that like, sometimes that you have to do for compliance because we find that people have to continuously repeat that box checking exercise. And that's because the industry is evolving and moving so fast. So we think that with this framework, you can continuously assess any new integration and continually assess existing integrations to make sure that they're being protected or they're getting guarded at the right level. And so the idea is to build a more long-term, durable framework for people so that you're not just wasting resources trying to over-secure the wrong things.
So with that in mind, we want to kind of hit home uh, once you have scope of coverage, kind of at least you have a mental model for your scope of coverage. This is a very simplified mental model for what the actual program looks like that those integrations would feed into. So regardless of the identity surface shifting and expanding, kind of ever evolving, so to speak. You need to be able to discover the identities in your environment, what they have access to, especially as environments scale. So doing this in an automated fashion rather than having the maintenance and the costs associated with trying to keep up with these more ephemeral systems. You need to be able to enforce policy at runtime, and that comes back to that dynamic business context that we were talking about across the entire action chain, especially with agents. So being able to get really specific and time bound in the way that access is provisioned and revoked. And then, of course, be able to prove what happened and why. And I think this last piece circles back into this first piece when you start monitoring for drift, and making sure that, as the systems evolve and as users um, start to actually take action and work with these policies, there's an inevitability of drift happening and violations. So just being sure that you have mechanisms in place where you can um, understand where that's happening and be able to pull that back into your access control framework so that this is kind of like a self-fulfilling system here.
Yeah, it creates this positive feedback loop, right?
Mhm.
Every iteration that you do should ideally be moving you towards a safer system. So, I mean, discover, control, prove, rinse, and repeat.
Yep. Amazing. Well, I think we came right up at time here, Miguel. Any closing thoughts or recommendations for getting started that you want to leave folks with?
I think we have a couple of blog articles that we'd recommend people check out if they're interested. And of course, yeah, I think that's it.
Great. Yep. So we'll throw those in the chat and in our follow-up comms. But really appreciate the time that everyone took to be here today, and would love your feedback too. This is an exciting space to be in and more important than ever. So the community and the collective knowledge sharing is super important to P Zero, and we look forward to more conversations just like this.